thank you so much for coming and joining us today as we are slowly exiting the world of virtual and re-entering the world of the world. We're also going to continue doing these virtual tours because we found that we quite like them. Something really nice about not being limited to how far a person can walk, or in a pub crawl case can be how long a person's bladder can hold up before we need to find a place to stop. Today, we're talking a little bit about some of the literary history of Brooklyn. I wanted to introduce the team. If folks could join up, we've got a good little team with us here today. Rose, who was the first one I saw up here, has been helping us in the background now for several months. She's actually only now recently done a personal tour. We did a private tour of Brooklyn a few weeks ago. So saw our virtual tour. She enjoyed what we did. She wanted to help out, and she has been helping out quite a bit. And in fact, she's really helped already elevate what we're doing, and she's helping us today in the background. We're really pleased with her participation. We're grateful. So please let her know how much we appreciate her, because we don't want to lose Rose. She works full-time at the nonprofit for the Global Health Core, which in her words has absolutely nothing to do with literature. So I think this is a real welcome change. So thank you, Rose. We appreciate you and love you here. Also with us, some of you may recognize Miranda, an actual lifelong Brooklynite. She has been with us for years. She works for the Brooklyn Conservatory of Music, but she and I met when she was swinging a very large, heavy piece of metal at my head in a class. This was intentional. This was not simply out of anger, but we were taking a stage combat class, and she heard about this tour, and she said, I want in. And she's been a wonderful addition to all of our tours, our Brooklyn and our Greenwich Village tour. She has a young child who's three now. We have several pictures of him on our pub crawls at the early age, so she's raising him right. So welcome, Miranda, and thank you for joining us today. And then lastly, we have Rebecca Bailey. Now, Rebecca Bailey worked really hard on the script and the PowerPoint presentation. She's a Maine native like myself. In fact, some of her early professional career was at Penobscot Theater up in Bangor, Maine, which is some of my early professional careers as an actor. She's an actress as well. In fact, she works a lot with $10 Theater Company up there, which is run by Julie Lisnett, who I did several shows with through Penobscot Theater. So we run in a lot of the same circles. She's from my alma mater. And actually, she is being played today by the role of Justin Steeve. She unfortunately had some wisdom teeth taken out, and it's hard to do a tour without your wisdom teeth, apparently. You become unwise, so to speak. But she did a lot of great work on this. We're bummed that she couldn't do it, but some cute PowerPoint animations that she put together. So we're really grateful for her work on this, and hopefully we'll get her back on a virtual tour when she can talk again.
Actually, that's something I wanted to ask you, Eric. I still have my wisdom teeth. So how many wisdom teeth are doing this tour? I have 4 wisdom teeth. Eric, do you have your wisdom
I have
teeth?
none.
So okay, so Rose, do you have any wisdom teeth? None? Okay. None? So I'm the wisest person here.
That is really weird. And feels wrong somehow. But
4 wisdom tooth tour.
Yeah. And 4 guys. We'll each take one of your teeth.
There we go. Exactly.
That being said, why don't we jump on in? I will say that Justin has been working with us for a long time here, and I've really appreciated all of his participation. And he has a newborn who is 3 months? 4 months?
3 months and a week.
A precious time, but that little youngster is screaming in the background outside of his soundproofed wall. And so after his participation, he did promise his wife that he will relieve her. And anyone who has had children knows how important it is for the wife to be relieved by their husband when we have a baby. So we hold no grudging for him, and we'll say a nice little farewell. But we should get started. And so we're going to start today with what we're going to refer to as our first official poet of New Amsterdam. And I have to put a little bit of a caveat here. This is a shot of New Amsterdam that was in Manhattan, but obviously the Dutch very quickly settled in the 1600s in Brooklyn as well. And they weren't the first residents here, of course, as many of us know. The Lenni Lenape tribe was through much of the northeast of what we now call the United States. And it's believed that they lived here for about 10 to 12,000 years. There were several dialects that were in the Brooklyn area. The Canarsie is probably one of the best known ones, as that name bounces around through a lot of Brooklyn. The Kings and Queens County was all their major area for a while. And I think one of the sort of the tragic aspects of and there are many when we deal with the Native American tribes here when the West came over. But one of them is that they didn't really have a written language. So much of their history is only told to us via the oral history that they remember and the history of the conquerors. And often the conquerors have a tendency to misalign the history to whatever is most convenient for themselves. So there is a lot that I think is lost that we can't get firsthand anymore. Very few structures. Much of what many tribes are nomadic, or they built temporary housing using wood and other elements that decay quickly. So there isn't a lot left behind as far as a written world and a written history, which makes it hard to find a poem by any of the early tribes. And so we will give Steendam at least the acknowledgement of being the first poet of New Amsterdam. Jacob Steendam is, of course, his name. He settled here, and the tribes here. This is a shot of the alleged sale of Manhattan to the Dutch by the Native Americans at the time for what was supposed to be 60 guilders. It's a slightly apocryphal story in the end. But this is a little shot of that time. And at first it was a little peaceful, but the Dutch really weren't thrilled with what they considered to be a lower class form of human, and so they very quickly initiated many wars against the native tribes, drove them out very quickly, and of course that tradition held true for all the other settlers that came here in the United States during that time. But he is still considered to be New York's poet, and part of it is because he loved New Amsterdam so much. He loved the nature and the wildlife. And so he worked writing for some pamphlets that were trying to encourage more people to come and settle in the new area. He had a home on Pearl Street for a while, as well as over in Amersfoort, which is now the flatlands of Brooklyn. Dutch native, he was described as one as being an industrious rhymester with a good memory of Bible texts, but his poems contained little that was worth preserving. But I did want to mention him only because he wrote a poem, and I find it very telling. It's an excerpt from these pamphlets promoting people to come, and the section goes like this: "You poor who know not how your living to obtain, you affluent who seek in mind to be content, choose you New Netherland, which no one shall disdain. Before you, time and strength here fruitlessly are spent. The birds obscure the sky, so numerous their flight. The animals roam wild and flatten down the ground. The fish swarm in waters and exclude the light. The oysters there, which none better can be found, are piled up heap on heap till islands they attain, and vegetation clothes the forest, mean and plain." Now, correct, there is very little of poetical merit in that poem, but what it really is telling for me is just how untouched this continent was before the West came. And this has come up many times, a flock of birds being so thick that it blocks out the sun. And when you think of the 3 billion-esque birds that have died over the last 75 years to 100 years in this country, oysters, I've seen descriptions of oysters that were 14 inches wide that could feed 2 people, a single oyster. Just the rich wildlife that is here, that is obviously in rapid decline. There's stories, Becca, in fact, not Justin, Becca had told me a story that we both heard. Sometimes a storm would come and heavy waves would just wash hundreds of lobsters up onto the shore. And I don't know if any one of us could experience a time when simply waves brought lobsters onto the shoreline. I mean, it really— That
sounds totally frightening. That sounds like a nightmare, to be honest.
A little bit, because those pinchers could go.
Yeah, exactly.
But they were known sort of as
a whole bunch of sea bugs are gonna come and swarm the shore. Oh my God! Do not hang out on the beach. Are you kidding? Yeah, that's crazy.
Remember, lobsters were lower class food. They're evil sea bugs coming to bite you.
Right. And it was just so easy to gain. They were lower class because it didn't take any skill. You just walked up to the shore, grabbed a bunch of them delicately,
and grabbed one. Yeah, before they grabbed your toes.
But that's Jacob Steendam. He unfortunately was not the greatest of people. He did own slaves. In fact, he petitioned the government to allow for easier access to slaves. But when he eventually left because the British took over and he lost all of his wealth and his possessions, he died. He moved back to Europe, and I think he worked for an orphanage for a while. So a very complicated person, certainly by modern standards, but a bit of a proponent of New Amsterdam. But truly, I think the great literary trend of Brooklyn begins with a poetical giant who loved to be referred to as "Oh Captain, my Captain."
Of course, Walt Whitman. So on the corner of Fulton Street and Cranberry Street, there was actually a very small publishing house. If anyone's been downtown Brooklyn, you sort of can find some of the area, but a lot of it is gone. There was a publishing house there sort of run by the Rome brothers, Andrew and James. And that is where the first few copies of Leaves of Grass was published. And it's really sort of seen as the birth of American poetry at the time. Now, the original version only had 12 poems. It didn't tell who the author was. It was only sold in 2 different stores, one in Manhattan and one in Brooklyn. And then he sort of just every few years would republish it and add new poems. And so instead of like coming out with a new edition or new whole book, he just sort of kept on changing this one and sort of became his real opus as he changed it year after year. And each one sort of really captures an evolution of the nation, as well as himself as an individual, and really what it meant to be an American and at that time. He's really sort of seen right now as one of the greatest American poets, but during his lifetime, his poetry was universally panned. People hated it. Then no one really wanted to buy it. They thought it was over sentimental, unstructured, way too personal. It just basically, the only reason it gets any good press is actually because Walt Whitman would actually send out sort of fake reviews of it, self-promoting it. In fact, there's a final New York Times review of Leaves of Grass that after he died, that stated that Whitman could never be seen as a great poet unless we deny poetry as an art. Ow, he just died. You know, he could be a little nicer. The thing is, though, in fact, even though, yes, you know, self-publishing their poetry wasn't looked at good on at that time, same as sort of nowadays, sadly. You know, just sort of pushed it on to his friends, pushed it on to everyone. He did at least, you know, have some good friends and some good colleagues in the poetry and literature world that really did love his stuff. He was a very strong lover of Emerson, who came before him. And so he actually sent Leaves of Grass to Emerson, sort of in a hope that at least, you know, he would like it. And Emerson actually wrote back to him a really sweet letter, which included the line, "I am not blind to the worth of the wonderful gift of Leaves of Grass. I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed." So you have some good colleagues for there. Now, you know, Whitman actually then had a bunch of major literature fans, but all of them are from the literature world. And so one of his major fans, weirdly enough, was actually a British man, Bram Stoker, the writer of Dracula. That's not actually him. I just love that picture. I highly recommend that terrible movie. It's so good.
Which one? There's 2 referenced here.
Yeah, so the first one is actually a play version, which I'm very angry that my parents saw before I was born. How dare they? With some of the most amazing drawings, and that is Raul Julia playing Dracula. And then the other, of course, is Gary Oldman in the movie Dracula. Both were amazing, I've been told. I've only seen one, sadly. Here, though, is actually Bram Stoker as a tiny baby and as a very wide-eyed, sort of looking lost young writer. And he was, in fact, very sort of lost and sort of trying to find himself when he first discovered Leaves of Grass. He wrote an actually incredibly long letter to Walt Whitman about his discovery and his reading of the book of poetry. And in the story, I'm sort of paraphrasing some of his lines. He has line, 4 years ago, I wrote the enclosed draft of a letter, which I intended to copy out and send to you. It has lain on my desk since then. You know what hostile criticism your work sometimes invokes here. and I wage a perpetual war with many of my friends on your behalf. But in the letter, he actually writes, how sweet a thing it is for a strong, healthy man with a woman's eye and a child's wish to feel that he can speak to a man who can be he wishes father and brother and wife to his soul. I don't think you will laugh, Walt Whitman, nor despise me, but at all events, I thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. Now, there are some questions what he meant by my kind, particularly if you actually look at the 1913 version of Leaves of Grass, which may have been the one that Bram Stoker was looking at, and see these amazing pictures from Margaret C. Cook drawings from this. Sadly, even with Scourging, we've not been able to find much about Martha Cook and these drawings. Maybe she was English, maybe she was Australian. But as you can see, there is most definitely some question about their type and their interest in some of these. And from this next image, you might understand that Whitman might have had a type as well. So there's a question on that and some support for Walt Whitman there.
I love this picture, and I love that Rose calls this the Gandalf picture.
Whitman really believed in getting a look. He understood from very early on that you really needed to have a look to sell yourself. He was always known for wearing the full beard, the cool suit. He was supposedly good for like whistling operas everywhere. He knew how to, sell himself well.
Whistling operas, I can't do that.
Right.
But while Whitman was writing, and indeed for the rest of his life, Brooklyn was still a separate city from Manhattan. So I'd like to talk about the bridge that helped bring the two cities, Manhattan and Brooklyn, together, as well as another poet who had a love affair with that bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge is one of the most iconic symbols of New York. It's a U.S. National Historic Landmark and also a historic civil engineering landmark. And as of 2017, is a tentative World Heritage Site. The first bridge built in the area, and this part, thinking about this, I really kind of dig it. It was finished in the late 1800s, but it was the first bridge in the area connecting Brooklyn and Manhattan. So that means from the 1600s until its Gothic towers rose up, the only way between both cities was by boat. So for over 200 years, there was this massive boat traffic, and I can only imagine all the boats that were all over the place, ferrying people back and forth. And
the Brooklyn Ferry itself was very iconic for Walt Whitman's time. In fact, he wrote a couple poems, and if you go down to where that location is, there's a few of his poems that are on display down there. So
the total length of the bridge is described as exactly 6,016 feet. Between the two towers is 1,595.5 feet. And according to architects who refurbished it in 1948, this kind of precision, as well as the fact that it was built to hold 2.5 times its expected weight and to be built 6 times stronger against expected wind shear, that these are some of the reasons why it's lasted so long and will continue to last far into the future. When it was completed, it was called the 8th wonder of the world. It still inspires countless books, poems, movies, predominantly as something to be admired. Most people admire it and talk about its beauty or talk about its engineering, relevance and a marvel. However, Henry James once cited it as an ominous symbol of New York's transformation into a steel-soled machine room. So it has at least one literary detractor. It's the only one I was able to find, though. Last month was the Brooklyn Bridge's 138th birthday. However, on a birthday cake, that would be 23 more candles than the New York Fire Code permits. So unfortunately, I guess they didn't have a cake for the bridge. Construction began in January of 1870 and then finished on May 24th, 1883. It was the world's first steel wire suspension bridge. It was also the longest suspension bridge for over 20 years until it was beat out by the Williamsburg Bridge. And in the same article that I found from 1948, by 1948, it was known as the 9th longest bridge in the world. So in building the bridge, it was originally designed and executed by a man named John Augustus Roebling. John Augustus Roebling died soon after the beginning of its construction. And so his son, Washington Augustus Roebling, also an engineer, took over. However, during the construction of the bridge, early construction of the bridge, when you're sinking the base of the aforementioned Gothic towers, so you can moor them in the water and under the water, a whole system was devised in order to pump air down into a chamber while they laid concrete and the foundation. At the time, they didn't know what the bends was. It was originally known as Caisson's disease and a decompression disease, too much pressure down there. Over 100 construction workers got the bends, including Washington Roebling himself. Because this was a brand new disease and people didn't know how to treat somebody with it, Roebling was reportedly rubbed down with a mixture of whiskey and salt. He probably would have been better if he was drinking the whiskey instead of being rubbed with it. This was supposed to help with his circulation. However, that didn't work. So Washington Augustus Roebling, he was bedridden for the next 13 years, and he oversaw work on the bridge from an apartment in Brooklyn Heights. He basically watched from a telescope to see how things were going. However, for this arrangement to fully work, his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, took over most of the chief engineer's duties. This included day-to-day supervision, project management, dealing with politicians, competing engineers. And the year before it was finished, she had to lobby politicians to keep her husband's name as the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge. By the end of the completion of the bridge, his health was really waning, and politicians wanted to get rid of him and bring on somebody new. And then that person would have been known as the chief engineer. And she fought and made sure that her husband's name stayed with that title. She is also known as an engineer. And so both she and her husband, Washington, jointly planned the Brooklyn Bridge more or less from its beginning until its completion in 1883. So jumping forward about 40 years, I'd like to talk about the poet Hart Crane, a brilliant young poet from Ohio. He was really taken by the beauty of the bridge. He loved Brooklyn Bridge and was desperate to stay in an apartment that Roebling had lived in. So he went around asking landlords which one Roebling was in, and the landlord mostly was just interested in taking his money and so lied to him and rented out a different unit. So he didn't quite get his dream, but I guess he believed he did. Anyway, while he was there overlooking the bridge in Washington Heights, he began writing his second book of poetry called The Bridge. This is around 1930, in between the two world wars, which was essentially an epic love note to the Brooklyn Bridge. A little bit about Hart Crane. He's from Garrettsville, Ohio. His mom was described as cannibalistically possessive, which just sounds awful. One story is that the reason why, isn't that just like visceral? It's like, oh God. One story is that because his name is Harold, but he didn't want to go by Harold. He changed his name to Hart because his mother was always yelling his name, Harold, in this really, shrill voice, and he couldn't stand to hear his own name. So this is why he preferred people call him Hart instead. Self-taught to write. He learned writing from the Elizabethans, such as Kit Marlowe and William Shakespeare, reading these, John Donne, and other 19th century French poets. And reportedly, he had started writing verse at an early age. He eventually dropped out of school in 1916. That's when he was about 17 years old. And then he moved to New York City as a teenager and started working as a copy editor. Quickly found his scene partying with just about every literary star of the time. He had a lot of what might be called at the time life issues. Besides his difficult childhood with his mother, he drank alcohol like it was the only activity on earth. In fact, he might be Eric. I don't know. What do you think? He might be one of the top 3 biggest drinkers on this tour.
Today's tour, yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah. If we were to do the drinking tour, yeah, big drinker. In fact, at these parties, he was known to have 3 levels of drunkenness. First level was warm affection, which is pretty nice. Next level is a brilliant monologue. It said that you get enough alcohol in him, and he would just naturally spout beautiful words and poetry. It just came out of him like a fountain. It said that Tennessee Williams kept a copy of of Hart Crane's poetry with him for inspiration at all times. Everybody wanted him at their party, at their artist's salon, but they all wanted him out before the 3rd level of drunkenness, which was known as broken furniture. Hart Crane got quite physical after he had too much alcohol. So there was really kind of a delicate balance between just enough and then too much, which was where he was at his most brilliant, apparently. He was also gay. He would often go down to the docks to pick up sailors. Unfortunately, we found a quote that Hemingway talked about Hart Crane, and he's quoted as saying, "Poor Hart Crane, always trying to pick up the wrong sailor." One of Hart Crane's difficulties in being gay was that sometimes he got lucky and sometimes he didn't. But when he didn't get lucky, he really didn't get lucky, and oftentimes a sailor would beat the living stuffing out of him. So he had kind of a lot of ups and downs in New York. We did find that he did try to have a heterosexual relationship once with a woman named Peggy Crowley, but that was just incredibly messy because it wasn't who he was. So there's a story about Hart Crane and the Brooklyn Bridge. Apparently one night, he and a friend had been drinking in Manhattan, and he took a cab, they took a cab back to Brooklyn. And he told the driver to specifically use the Brooklyn Bridge. He always just wanted to use the Brooklyn Bridge, no other bridge to get back home. The driver, however, got turned around, took the Manhattan Bridge instead. Crane realized this immediately, about halfway through. He forced the cab to stop. He jumped out of the cab and proceeded to relieve himself on the Manhattan Bridge to show his disdain and his disgust of this non-Brooklyn Bridge. In fact, I believe we found actual footage of Hart Crane peeing on the bridge. Rose, if you please. Yeah, there we go. There we go. There it is. There he is, right there. You can totally see him. You can totally see him right there.
If you zoom in, you get like, it's the pinch mode on your trackpad.
It's amazing. It's amazing how the 1930s modern helicopter shot found Hart Crane. This is actually us in our time machine helicopter. We have one as part of the part of the pub crawl.
What do they say on like every crime show from like the 40s? Like, can you zoom in? Or can you clean up the shot? Like they always like depixelated. Exactly. Yep, that's Hart Crane.
Can you do something impossible with this picture? Why, yes, I can do something impossible with this picture in the next 7 seconds, so it doesn't ruin the narrative of our TV show.
I would like to say that the Witches Wizard of Oz were brought to us by Rebecca Bailey. That was the map and that animation. It was one of her little touches that I just loved when she put it in there. And she's actually joined us. She is in the attendance, and so we hope you're feeling better. We hope your face isn't too swollen. We hope you don't miss your teeth. And thanks for coming and great work. But
so when they finally crossed the Manhattan Bridge and got to Hart Crane's apartment, the story goes on. Hart Crane jumped out of the cab, and his friend that he was with jumped out after him, close on his heels. Hart was tackled as he ran up the stairs of his building and got to his roof. He was attempting to throw himself off, and his friend tackled him before he could throw himself off and demanded, why was he about to do this? Hart Crane exclaimed, more or less, what's the point of living if I'm not writing? He believed this about himself, that if he had writer's block, he immediately wanted to end it. It was too painful for him. Despite his tumultuous lifestyle, my tongue got in the way of my speaking. Hart Crane always found the beauty in even the most dark moments of his life. Someone once described this imagery, his imagery and his writing, as modern industrial landscape juxtaposed against the promise of some great spiritual reckoning of America. Here's an excerpt from the bridge. O harp and altar of the fury fused, how could mere toil align thy choiring strings? Terrific threshold of the prophet's pledge, prayer of pariah and the lover's cry. Again, the traffic lights that skim thy swift, unfractioned idiom, immaculate sigh of stars, beating thy path, condense eternity. And we have seen night lifted in thine arms.
That really is quite a juxtaposition of modern industrial landscape and the promise of some kind of great spiritual reckoning.
Spiritual reckoning. I say that every morning when I wake up and read my Hart Crane.
I mean, the bridge is gorgeous. If you've never walked across the bridge, if you are coming to New York anytime, I highly recommend. It's one of the best things to do in New York is to walk across the bridge, and it is fantastic. But I will say, as a born and bred Brooklynite, it did sort of partly help to destroy Brooklyn and start the Great Mistake. This is sometimes called the Great Joining, Greater New York, all these nice versions. But really, as a born and bred Brooklynite again, it was taught to me from very long childhood that it's called the Great Mistake. And that was when Manhattan basically gobbled up all of the neighborhoods around them. So they took in Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, all together to make one big city. And as you can see from some of the political cartoons of the time, not everyone agreed with this idea. You see Brooklynites opposing the merger there. When they did actually put it to a vote for Brooklyn, it ended up being only 300 margin, in which, remember, Brooklyn at the time was the third largest city in the United States. The first was Manhattan, the second was Chicago, and Brooklyn was the third. So when we talk about 300 margin, it's a really tight margin. It's like a Brexit type of margin. It's really low. And yet, so we lost to them.
It's a great analogy.
One of the reasons, of course, that people did vote for it was because Manhattan had cut off our water supply. Now, we were stealing it from Manhattan, so I guess it's, sort of reasonable for that. But the reason why Manhattan really cared about this was because Chicago had actually starting to become the largest city in the United States, and it was so big that it actually had gotten the last big World's Fair, and Manhattan could not let that happen. And so they needed to make sure that they were going to be the largest city forever, and so grabbed up as many places and people of land as possible to become this huge, huge city that we know of Greater New York. That made a lot of Brooklyn be sort of the suburb in the way of Manhattan that many people thought of. And it really isn't until the last 30 or 40 years it sort of came back into its own as showing off how cool it really is in terms of the literature, the arts, the food, and everything for Brooklyn.
Now, would you say if Brexit is the British exit from the European Union, would we be able to call this Brentrance for the Brooklyn entrance to New York City? Is this their Brentrance?
The problem is it's more like a takeover. I feel like you need, hostile takeover of its, Brooklyn colonization, Brook College shit. No, I'm not getting.
For some reason, I always in my mind, and I don't think it's in my mind, I've always thought of the stories like the vote. It came down to a 2-vote difference, like it was that it was that close. And I know that's apocryphal, but I like that idea of if only those 2 people had voted differently. Yeah. So now we're gonna hit our first and only bar that we're going to share on the tour. It is the oldest bar, and it's called the Brooklyn Inn. But to properly start it, like any good tour that we would do, we'd usually want to start with a bit of a toast. So for those of you who opted to share a little bit of a beverage of spirit or beer or wine, because some people drink wine, wanted to share a little bit of a toast. And this is, here's to those who've seen us at our best and seen us at our worst and can't tell the difference. Cheers. And we are in this together. And thank you for spending a little of this time together with us as we are approaching a little bit past the halfway point. But the Brooklyn Inn was begun in 1885 by a German immigrant by the name of Anton Zeiner. We don't have many pictures before the 1960s of this place, unfortunately. So you'll see a couple of the 60s and more modern. Zeiner was a Brooklyn resident. I think he lived around the corner on Bergen Street for a while. He already had a saloon when he was trying to reconvert this residential place into a second saloon. And there was a big push against this. In fact, there was a local bishop who fought really hard to get the opening of the saloon. He was against all saloons and the depravity that came along with having saloons, and saloon owners tended to take offense to this. And so Zeiner was a major member of this, and they managed to win the license. And as the Daily Eagle reported, Mr. Zeiner gets his license. So apologies to Bishop Little John and Deacon Richardson, but the bar did exist. And it is, as far as we can tell, the only bar from that time to still remain.
Mr. Zeiner gets his license. Eric, Mr. Zeiner gets his license. Doesn't that sound like a children's book?
It does kind of, doesn't it?
Yeah, we should write that. We should write that children's book for the
I like that.
Mr. Zeiner gets his license. We'll get somebody to illustrate it for us.
It's either that or it's a really heartwarming a story about, a man who has his opus to open a bar in Brooklyn, and everything goes against him, and his life is. But at the finally end, all his bar patrons show up and buy that drink from him.
Right, exactly.
The angel gets his wings.
right, exactly. He can pay off the landlord because everybody buys beer from him, and it's a heartwarming Christmas tale, I guess.
That's right. Now Zeiner ran this place until his death, which was only a few years later at the age of 48. He died a fairly young man in his home. I believe it was of a heart attack. In 1892, his wife, Marie, began running it, and she took over the back room, and she really was instrumental in bringing a lot of the woodwork. If you go into the bar, there's a lot of great woodwork inside of the bar. It's all sort of the German style architecture. In fact, there's still a stained glass that has the AZ initials for Anton Zeiner there. But she ran it until she died. Well, no, she ran until 1896, and then the Huber Brewery took over. Huber Brewery. Huber Brewery. I have a Maine accent. I can't say these words. Drawer. They helped also with a lot of the inspiration of that German Bohemian style artwork for a while. A funny side note: I just found out that when Marie died, she remarried. And she died in 1910. And when she died, in her will, there was a news article about how the fact that she left her most recent husband $1 in her will. And left the equivalent was about $1,500 for all of her children, and said in the wills, because all of this was hard, money that was worked hard by hands by the family and by her former husband. So apparently she threw her more recent husband a buck just to say, well, thanks for thanks for sending me off properly, but all my money goes.
Right. Here's the cab fare home from the funeral.
Exactly. Put that under your pillow when you lose a tooth. Like any good salon of that time period, it was very much a man's salon. Although they did allow women in for a period of time, but the women had a separate entrance. And in fact, in this picture, if you look to the right of that picture window, actually go back one rows, there's that sort of that blank wall area there. That used to be apparently a secondary entrance for women and children to go in. They bricked it over, and that's where the restrooms are now. So it would be a very awkward entrance to go into. This next shot is a shot of Brooklyn as of 1 month and 4 days ago. It is still a great bar to kind of get into. During the 1900s, it was run by Martin and Dora Heifenbüttel. Yeah, thank you. They lived upstairs as well. And then during Prohibition, apparently they got a little bit creative with supplying their own alcohol because it was a speakeasy for a while. And in fact, at one point they were getting raided by the feds, and they literally had a bathtub of alcohol, I assume gin, upstairs that they were making to sell downstairs. And in a moment of inspiration, Dora stripped down her kids, put them in the bathtub with the hopes that the feds would see this and just assume, and like, oh, well, we're not going to go in there, which is exactly what they did. They opened the door, saw a bathtub with 2 kids in the water and said, oh, well, okay, we won't go in there. And the gamble paid off. And although we've often wondered what a bath of pure gin would feel like, we would encourage you to go and try it and let us know, because I think we were going to skip that one ourselves.
I also hope they didn't sell that water, the gin later. I'm just thinking like, special gin that you're selling later on. It's
right, exactly. It's got a sort of
unfortunately, we do not know, but based on speculation, I don't know if I would have been working the bar that next week. It wouldn't have been the right time there. Regulation was so bad that in fact, I mean, all these jokes are like going blind from being drunk comes from Prohibition, because you just, who knew what was getting cut as they were putting it in there, and then people were dying from just taking a single drink and going blind. And in fact, a lot of our mixed drinks, some of those frou-frou drinks, were all attempts to soften just the harsh and bitter taste of poorly made alcohol. So that's where a lot of your grasshoppers and tequila sunrises and all these other specialty drinks came about, was just to soften the blow.
I highly recommend. There's an amazing book called The Poisoner's Handbook, which is all about the coroner from the time in New York during Prohibition. And it talks about all the different types of things that people poisoned each other with. But one of the big ones, of course, was alcohol, and how many people died and how many different ways that basically it was the government actually poisoning alcohol to try to make it so people wouldn't drink it. And us being us, we just kept on drinking it anyway, even though we knew it probably was going to kill us. So you're not going to keep those away from us.
Sure.
Well, after Martin and Dora Heifenbüttel stopped working at that bar, it was owned by Mickey Castellano in the 60s, and in the 80s it was run by Karen Hubert and Leonard Allison, and it was actually called Hubert's for a while, until eventually they relocated their name. And then the current owners took over in around 1990 and turned it into the Brooklyn Inn. It has been a big literary hotspot. Jonathan Latham writes about it in Motherless Brooklyn. He calls it the Bohemian Hill Inn, a few sections there. And then Jonathan Ames, who wrote Bored to Death, which was a semi-popular show on HBO, sort of one of these quirky mystery detective stories. And it had quite a big following that, in fact, when it was closing earlier than everyone had hoped, there was a big outcry against it. And so Jonathan Ames basically, I think, posted on Twitter and said, hey, if you make it out here tonight at the Brooklyn Inn, I'm going to buy the last round, which cost him about $6,000. So many people showed up and it was so full they ended up having to exit out of there. But we're going to skip a chunk of time because we are running out of time with some of the literary movements that happened. Obviously, H.P. Lovecraft. I don't know if it's obvious, but H.P. Lovecraft did live in Brooklyn for a while. Great horror writer, not so nice on the social front, bit awkward, bit creepy, bit racist, but great horror writer and inspirational if you can let those other things aside. Henry Miller lived and wrote for a long time. His wife, June, they were together for a little bit. N.A. Nin was also there for a while. They had a famous literary affair. But we wanted to move forward to a house that is probably one of the most unique living arrangements in all of Brooklyn.
It's good that you mentioned Anais Nin, because Anais Nin is the person who named this house that Eric is alluding to. This house used to be on 7 Midda Street in Brooklyn Heights. I say used to. It was known as the February House. That's what Anais Nin dubbed it. It doesn't exist there anymore, though, because it was sadly demolished in 1945 as a casualty of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. You know, Robert Moses, of course, destroyed quite a lot of New York. Sadly, this house was one of those things that was annihilated. It left, however, quite a legacy. At this time, this is around 1940, 1945, nearly a third of Brooklyn was commuting into Manhattan for work. And Brooklyn Heights, possibly known as the first suburb of America, quickly became a hotbed for writers and artists who were looking to escape the core of the Big Apple and live just somewhere else outside of Manhattan. And Nin had aptly called it the February House because most of the residents happened to have February birthdays. In the fall of 1940, former editor for Harper's Bazaar and Mademoiselle magazines, a man named George Davis, first rented the house with newly famous Carson McCullers. Carson McCullers was 23 years old, recently divorced, and was enjoying recognition for her first novel, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. She was also a notorious drinker. Gypsy Rose Lee, I actually have never pronounced her real name, Rose Louise Hovick, I guess. Hovick is her name. Gypsy Rose Lee. We all know Gypsy Rose. I mean, we don't know Gypsy Rose. I know of Gypsy Rose, I should really say. More commonly known as Gypsy Rose. Like the most famous burlesque star of the day. Her life was an inspiration for the musical Gypsy. W.H. Auden was also living there. He was already a well-known poet when he joined this group, but he lost access to his money back in war-torn Europe. And so he also needed to escape from his particularly nosy landlady who would regularly approach Auden to tell him that she liked to keep an eye on her tenants to, quote, make sure there's nothing unsavory going on. And as an out gay man, Auden understood that her true meaning was that she didn't really approve of his lifestyle. Also, he was flat broke. The rent that Auden was paying on his previous apartment before he moved to the February House, he would have covered the entire house at 7 Middaugh Street. So rent was real low. When he first moved into the place, the house also had no heat or hot water. So to pay his rent, Auden reportedly wrote a poem along with a letter to a friend of his at the New Yorker. And with the poem, it has this. It says, quote, "Dear Harry," his friend at the New Yorker, "please sell this to the New Yorker, as I am very, very, very poor. I still have no hot water. I still have no hot water." Really desperate missive. Also at the house were Richard Wright, who he only stayed with a little while at February House with his family. Composer Benjamin Britten and his partner stayed there for a while. Paul and Jane Bowles found inspiration there, both for their art and for their open marriage. And Thomas Mann's entire family stayed there for a bit too, they needed somewhere to stay after fleeing Nazi Germany. So living at this house with all these artists flowing in and out at various times was more like an insane soap opera. There was partying, there was sleeping around, people were stealing food. There was even an attempted murder. Auden once tried to strangle his lover for cheating on him. But despite
you really see how
chaos,
many plot lines of the Brady Bunch actually came from the February House. Like just in that description, there's like 7 Brady Bunch episodes, as I recall.
Right.
Attempted murder, stealing food. I mean,
everybody, right? Yeah.
Oh, Marcia, that's my brisket.
Man, oh man, just nuts. There was a lot of professional work, however, done at the February House. So during this time, they were feeding off one another. Art begets art. So while living there, Auden, for example, published his work, The Double Man. Gypsy Rose Lee, she wanted to live there because she was writing a murder book with George Davis called The G-String Murders, which I think is kind of fun. Composer Benjamin Britten was working on a new opera. Carson McCullers was starting her second novel while she was living there, called The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. And I mentioned Paul and Jane Bowles. When they moved in, Jane began work on her story, Two Serious Ladies. Paul, however, his job was to try to sleep with everyone else. And at various times, Salvador Dali lived there, Kurt Weill, who wrote the Threepenny Opera, lived there, actress Lotte Lenya, and Truman Capote. So as I said, the place was crazy. Who knows, perhaps the February House was also an inspiration for a movie about another famous house, possibly Animal House. I mean, there's a lot of connections there, maybe. So author Richard Wright, we want to speak a little bit about him because he's pretty terrific. He attempted to live there for a short while, like I said, but he needed to leave because of the overt flirtations with from Anais Nin, who was always trying to get him to leave his wife and sleep with her. The chaos eventually became too much, and so then he wasn't even there a year. And he said to his wife, as they were leaving, why they were leaving, he said that it was not a proper environment in which to raise a child, and he was probably right. Richard Wright had a really tough childhood himself. He was born and raised in Mississippi, and by the age of 12, he had not yet had a single complete year of schooling. However, when he was finally admitted into public school when he was 13, he progressed up through the 6th grade in a matter of a couple of weeks. And then by 15, he had published his first story called The Voodoo of Hell's Half Acre in the local paper, which is a really awesome title. I think that's a really great title, The Voodoo of Hell's Half Acre. So good. He eventually joined the Great Migration that refers to families leaving the South and heading north to Chicago. And then through a series of ups and downs during the Great Depression, he ended up working with the National Negro Congress and spoke at the Chicago Convention with the goal of funding publications that would secure work for African-American writers, giving them an opportunity to have their voice heard. Richard Wright probably, I should have said this earlier, he's probably best known for, in 1940, writing Native Son, and then in 1945, Black Boy. Those are probably his two most known works. When he was in New York City, he met Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, and later on moved, they talked a lot, they talked a good game about Paris and said how Paris was amazing, a lot less racism there, and that he should go and continue writing. And so he later moved there, and he spent the rest of his life in Paris and fell in love with writing haikus, which is kind of interesting. There it is.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know that he
Richard
wrote
Wright haiku, yeah, book of haikus. His work is credited with helping to change race relations in the U.S. in the 20th century. Amiri Baraka once said that, quote, Wright was one of the people who made me conscious of the need to struggle. And in 1941, Wright wrote a novel called The Man Who Lived Underground about police brutality by white officers against a black man. However, it was rejected by publishers and never published until his daughter, Julia, who was a writer herself and a prison rights activist, found this manuscript, and it was just published in April of this year, just a couple of months ago, which is kind of great. And
70 years later, and the book is
found manuscript. Yeah.
Now there's another, and actually on that moment, I do want to say thank you, Justin, because I know you got to jump off and be a dad.
I got to get going.
And which we appreciate. So fond farewell.
It's true.
Justin,
thank
Steve, go be a dad. Tell Grace we said hi.
Have fun. I will. Sounds good. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
There's another literary luminary with a February birthday, but who never got a chance to live at Midos Street, but he did help pave the way for Richard Wright, and that is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He was a writer, activist, publisher, one of the original members of the NAACP, which was founded in 1910 at the Cooper Union in East Village. And ironically enough, while Du Bois was the only Black American executive in the original 1910 organization. It was almost all run by white men for a very long time. He was also a founder for the NAACP magazine called The Crisis, which is still running today. It was one of the first magazines to really focus on Black writers and the Black experience. And he said, the object of this publication is to set forth those facts and arguments which show the danger of race prejudice, particularly as manifested today toward colored people. It takes its name from the fact that the editors believe that this is a critical time in the history of the advancement of men. Finally, its editorial page will stand for the rights of men irrespective of color or race, for the highest ideals of American democracy, and for reasonable but earnest and persistent attempts to gain these rights and realize these ideals. Sadly, we should say he's ahead of his time because we really haven't met his time yet. In 1950, his wife, Nina, of over 50 years, passed away. And around a year later, he remarried, at the age of 33, he remarried Shirley Graham, who was about 30 years younger. And I actually didn't know a lot about her, and I've learned a lot through this process because she herself was a writer and an activist and an artist. She had a strong focus in theater, which is where a lot of our backgrounds come from. And she worked for the Federal Theater Project in Chicago before it was shut down in 1939 by a group of anti-communists, Elizabeth Dilling being the main part of this. She was a white supremacist and staunch anti-communist, as well was Senator Robert Rice Reynolds, both pictured here. He was a Nazi sympathizer and anti-Semite, and they sought to defund the Federal Theater Project, and they eventually succeeded. In the early 1940s, she worked at the Phyllis Wheatley Young Women's Christian Association in Indianapolis, Indiana. And she focused on establishing a theater program there. But once again, this started to get shut down by none other than our friend Elizabeth Dilling, the anti-communist and white supremacist and anti-Semite. She was a darling of the 1930s right wing and conservatives. She was a staunch isolationist, working to keep America out of World War II. And her publication, The Red Network, was widely distributed as a who's who's on who she believed to be communists. The book was distributed by the KKK, Aryan bookstores, was widely read by the Pinkerton Detective Agency in Chicago, the Chicago and New York police departments, and the FBI ultimately launched an anti-communist backlash against many writers, including Shirley Graham Du Bois. The Brooklyn connection is that in 1955, the couple bought 31 Grace Court and moved there, which shouldn't really sound like that big of a deal. The couple sees a house, they have the money, they get the loan, they buy the house, and they move in. However, in 1955, Rosa Parks has yet to give up a seat to a white man on a bus in the United States of America, which was, of course, a crime in the United States of America. And we are very thick in redlining, where there were strong attempts to keep blacks out of certain neighborhoods, to lower property values, and deny rents and deny, I guess more importantly, loans. So the fact that they were able to move there at Brooklyn Heights at that time was a bit of a feat. And it was partially due to Arthur Miller, who owned the house before them, and he helped sort of facilitate them being able to gain access to the apartment. Now, he wrote Death of a Salesman at that house in 1949, and he lived in numerous locations throughout Brooklyn, all through the 40s and 50s, until he left his wife to marry Marilyn Monroe in 1956, and he moved to Manhattan. During that marriage is when he was called before the House of Un-American Activities Committee. He refused to name names and eventually was tried without a jury and found to be in contempt of court, fined, and spent a short time in jail. In 1961, Monroe and Miller would split, and less than a year later, Marilyn Monroe would die by what is believed to have been suicide at that time. But and so obviously we have a great family story there, temptation taking away from family. He was not a great father during this time with Marilyn Monroe. But of the many things that would emerge in the 1960s Brooklyn, one of them would be the literary publications of the writer Paula Fox, another longtime Brooklyn resident who herself also struggled with family and marriage.
So Paula Fox is most known for a lot of her books. She started actually not till she hit 40s or so, is really where she started writing and being able to really shape a successful career as an author. But as Eric mentioned, she had a lot of struggles with her early years right from birth. She was born in New York City in 1923. Her parents were successful screenwriters, but also heavy drinkers. And generally just fairly miserable people. And in fact, her mother had had 4 abortions before her, and Paula actually believed that she had meant to have a 5th abortion and was just too slow. And that is why she was born. So in fact, right at her birth, she was rejected, left off at an orphanage, and her parents moved off to the West Coast. Paula Fox's grandmother actually cared for her for a little while, but then gave her off to a family friend, Reverend Elwood Corning, who was really the one who sort of brought her up. She would sort of bounce around to different family members, sometimes be taken back by her parents for like a week or two, and then be sent back to the Reverend. So not the best of childhoods. And so she had an interview talking about herself as a writer and what it meant. And she said, "It struck me very early. My father brought me a box of books once when I was about 3.5 or 4. I remember the carton they were in and the covers with illustrations by Newell C. Reith, the wonderful illustrator of Robert Louis Stevenson and other books like Robin Hood. I remember how struck I was by the ending when Robin Hood is supported by the window and he shoots his last arrow. I was very affected by it. You can see here the gorgeous pictures from this." The interviewer asked, "Did your father read these books to you?" And Fox, of course, replied, No. He didn't stay long enough. He only stayed for a couple of hours, then a cab to take him home. No, Mr. Corning read them to me, and then he taught me to read when I was very little." Now, Reverend Elwood Corning was a newspaperman and a Jesuit priest who was very formative in her early years. But she still had a lot of issues as she would grow up. She got married at 17, had a child herself, gave it up for adoption, married again later on in her early 30s, and did that again. In between her marriages, in her 20s, she gave birth to another child, Linda Carroll, and it was unnamed, the father. though at the time she was actually living with famed acting coach Stella Adler, and was very good friends with Marlon Brando. So we can, of course, speculate who Linda Carroll's father might have been, but has never been named. Fox actually gave Carroll up also for adoption as well, and she never actually met Paula Fox until she was an adult. Linda Carroll's an author herself, including, as you see, her book here, My Mother's Daughter, a memoir of the mother I never knew, and my daughter, Courtney Love. So Courtney Love was actually the granddaughter of Paula Fox. Yes, that Courtney Love, the one who later married Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, and became the dysfunctional, tragic, rock couple of the 90s that we all remember. Now, Paula Fox, as a young woman, actually did a lot of different traveling. She worked different jobs. She was actually part of the post-liberation in Poland during World War II. But it's when she moved to Brooklyn in her 40s that she started really writing novels. And we mostly know her for a lot of her adult books, but she actually was a major children's writer at the time. Wrote a huge number of children's books, including on something called The Slave Dancer. And this one actually deals with the savagery of the Atlantic slave trade. As you can see, has won a lot of Newbery Awards and such. And it feels like a very dark story for children's books, but we often have tendency to shield and protect children, was not done as much at that time. And she also really believed that it was important for this. She said, human history is part of a history of suffering. Children know more of pain than you think. It's inborn. And then don't need artificially happy endings. So she really believed in showing what there was happening here. Now, of course, her most famous book, most known, is Desperate Characters. As you can see here, two different versions, and also a movie that they actually made of the book. And I'm going to give a short quote about it, so it really gets a sense of the neighborhood they were in. It really is written about Brooklyn Heights and gets you a sort of visual of what it was like to live in Brooklyn Heights at the time. They turned up Henry Street. Otto noted with satisfaction, there's as much garbage as in their own neighborhood. You wouldn't consider buying a house on the Heights. Horribly inflated prices. All that real estate grinning in dusty, crumbling rooms. Think what you could do with that woodwork. Everyone knowing it was a put-up job. Greed, a low-belly greed, and get it while you can. House prices enunciated in refined accents. Mortgages like progressive diseases. I live on the Heights.
Oh, very nice, Miranda. Thank you very much. So just real quickly to wrap up, we did want to talk a little bit about some of the current scenes that are happening in Brooklyn right now. And I think probably the best sense of what this current literary scene is like in Brooklyn is represented by the bookstore Books Are Magic. Now, this is a small little independent bookstore. It's probably one of the best independent bookstores in the city now. And there's stiff competition in New York City because it is a literary city all the same. Much of this is sort of inspired by a bookstore that is no longer around that was down the street on Court Street called Book Court. And several of the employees kind of moved on to do other greater literary things. One of them is the woman who opened this bookstore with her husband, and that would be Emma Straub. She's the daughter of Peter Straub, who is a bit of a horror writer, worked with Stephen King for a while. She's written several sort of short stories and has a few books published out, but she's really become well-known, one of the biggest literary influencers on social media. She's up there with Neil Gaiman and being one of the most influential and followed literary figures on social media. And she runs Books of Magic. She was a former employee at Book Court, and it's definitely a great bookstore to check out if you're ever in that area. She's on my reading list, so I can't speak with any authority on her novels, but as you can see from these pictures, I'm sure they're very quirky and a lot of fun. She's really good at cultivating a literary scene. They do a lot of readings and book unveilings and whatnot. And they also, on the outside of it, it's such an artistic place. They have this beautiful mural that they have outside of it. And I wanted to show this picture because the person in this picture is another guide of ours, Marissa Levine, who is a former Book Court employee and will be doing a reading of her newly published book, The World Gives Way, at Books Are Magic, coming up in the next week or so. It's a sci-fi novel. It just came out on hardcover. There's getting a lot of buzz about this book. And so if you're looking for something new, if you like a little bit of sort of that sci-fi alternate future history, Marissa is a wonderful woman, a very creative, artistic personality. And I have 2 copies of her book already, and I'm excited to read it. So that is our last sort of shout out to the Brooklyn Bohemian scene on our tour. So thank you so much for joining us. Many of the names here I recognize from having come on some of our other tours. So I really appreciate that you continuing to support us virtually. And I hope that as we get back to in person, you will join us again. You can follow us on social media if you're not already. You can sign up on our mailing list, which I think all of you might be right now, but it is at our website. And if you enjoyed this tour and you want to see some of our other virtual versions of the tour, we are on YouTube. You can search and follow us there. And beyond that, if you did enjoy it, please spread the word. Let people know about our website, get people to sign up on our mailing list, because we will continue these free virtual tours. Even though we are emerging, we're getting back to work. We're getting back to our normal lives. Tours are happening again. People are going back into the office. I really hope that we don't lose the fact that we are in this together. And that's been one of the spirit of our tours, in person and virtually, for a very long time, is to remind us who we were, where we came from, why we are who we are. Some of these writers, some of these authors shaped our experiences that we have today. So we will continue to be in this together. I hope to raise a glass with you together in person someday. And thank you once again for joining us.
We did get a question in the Q&A, Eric. If there's a Paula Fox book that one of us would recommend.
So, I mean, I would recommend, I would say Desperate Characters is amazing. It is, I would recommend only reading it at a point when you're willing to deal with the idea of the world being very dark and sad, because it is, our main characters are a woman who is really dealing with the idea of who she is and what is her community anymore, especially as sadly a woman who's had 2 miscarriages. And so she's sort of thinking about what that is, and as her marriage is falling apart as well. But it's such an amazing description of what it's like in that neighborhood, especially at the time, and thinking about sort of people moving in and sort of gentrification and sort of figuring out her as like a mid-end one. So it's amazing.
Well, and I love that the precept at the very beginning is then she gets bitten by a cat or scratched by a cat. And so she's not sure if she has rabies and is going to die in the next 24 or 36 hours, but she still goes about her business. So all throughout, she's constantly going back to, should I get this looked at? What is going on? And so this obsession between cats and culture seems to be sort of an underlying precept. And I love that as a kickoff point for the book.
I'll volunteer a question of my own. Does the literary pub crawl want to or desire to put out any sort of recommended reading list at any point in the future for people to follow and add things to their Goodreads list? Because I know, like you, Eric, I've got like a bajillion books, like more books than a lifetime, but it's always good to learn about new ones that might be useful for learning about New York literary culture and history, that kind of thing.
I think it's a great idea to do. I also think that like it's putting a little note about each one. I remember the first time when I started actually on the pub crawl, I had known about, many of these writers, but I hadn't read a lot of their work. And so I decided to be very methodical about it. And I was like, all right, what is the first writer written in the script? Anais Nin. Great. I will take out a book of Anais Nin. So I'm sitting there reading Delta Venus on the subway. And if you've ever read it, is your mother-in-law gone now? Am I allowed to be less? It is something you incredibly blush at. It is not a thing to read on the subway. It is very, very, very pornographic. And so it was an interesting thing to slowly get in here. I would say like anyone who's read, 50 Shades of Grey, throw that out, go for it, find Delta Venus. That's the one you really want. But it's, it's most definitely an interesting thing going through some of these books and learning more and more of the different writers we talk about as tour guides.
Well, it's funny, Rose, because that suggestion has come up before from certain members of our staff who've recommended on some of our weekly meetings that perhaps we should put that up there, Rose. So I definitely will be. It's definitely something that's in the works. We used to have a list a while ago, but it's added to the list of tasks that we're always looking for help and volunteers with. But one of the things that came up for me is when I started doing the tours really regularly, is I didn't want to just regurgitate information from other tours and research and Wikipedia and the internet, but beyond just doing research, I wanted to be able to talk with some degree of authority on the books themselves. And so I made a point to try to read as much as I could of the people that we talk about. So I'm not just, like I said, regurgitating the information, but the problem is I stopped reading living authors because I was just so inundated with all of these authors that I want to read, and some great stuff, some tricky stuff, You really get a sense of how writing styles have changed, how our attention spans have changed, and just sort of the artistic vibe of culture at the time. But I've had to make a point of finding new and current and living writers, and who's the next writers that people will be talking about on a tour 50 or 60 years from now. So it's a tricky balance to ride. And like you said, Rose, it's impossible to get them all. It's a matter of like what hits you at the right time. Certainly a lot of my reading has changed just culturally with some of the dynamics that were going on, and how do we focus on what are the things that were missed in our upbringing and research and the history that was told to us by the conquerors. What else is out there for us to find? So we will work on it, I promise.
Yeah, I'll help too.
Thank
keep
you.
talking about it, so I'll get to work on it. There's also a question that we have here about February House, if we have some time. Is anybody still here?
Yeah, no, we've got quite a few people. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So Gypsy Rose Lee and Thomas Munn seemed like very different people to be living in the same house. What was it about the February House that might have been so alluring for artists to live together?
Wow, that's quite a question. To a certain point, we could kind of speculate. There's something about the community of artists and especially writers for a long time. And you can go back to, Shakespeare and Marlowe hanging out at some of the same bars, and the fact that in many cases, like the communal house, the public house, the pub, for a long time served a function as being an area that people could gather for some light, for some food, for a drink, because they couldn't get these in their house. I mean, it was providing a service for getting amenities that didn't necessarily exist. So that it did serve a purpose beyond just, doing shots and getting drunk, which is what it later kind of became about. But it was a social gathering. It was a warmer place to get together. And so you had writers that would artists bouncing things off each other, making a community. And so I have a feeling that the February House sort of became that. Started with a couple of people, and I met somebody who needed a place. I'm like, hey, we got a room, come stay with us. And it's almost like that college. It's almost like a college frat house. I mean, the Animal House. I hate that analogy, but that concept of a group of younger, in many cases, people getting together. It's an opportunity to afford a living situation. It was a fairly large house, but I really think it was just the emotional appeal of, oh, that sounds kind of cool. Well, these sounds like cool people.
Yeah, and cheap. Cheap is a very important thing, of course.
Yeah. And near also the water, as Rebecca just pointed out in the chat, it was near the water.
There's also something about people. I actually have read G-String Murder, which I highly recommend. It's a very fun murder mystery. Our main character is Gypsy Rose Lee. So she's, but it really gets a sense of what the world of that sort of theater and burlesque at the time was like. So it's a really cool thing with that. But also just thinking about, like, people talked about her and we read about her, like she was actually a very sort of mothering character. Like she really liked having people to take care of, and having a sort of almost like she grew up in a very dysfunctional family that traveled a whole lot. And so having, this sort of almost space where she took care of people. There's stories of her and W. Jordan like making dinner for everyone and having these sort of communal times together in a way that's really important, that I could see people really enjoying that sort of style.
Great question. Well, you can always contact us through the website or social media if another question comes up. And certainly word of mouth is still, no matter what we do, is still one of our best means of advertisement. So if you have been enjoying, and for those of you, Mr. Steele, I've seen your name pop up quite a bit, and I really appreciate you're constantly coming back, and we're sort of learning our virtual crowd and we can't recognize faces anymore. So apologies to others who've been there, but anytime that you can make a suggestion or a like, or share a link, or invite people to the website, we do want to kind of build our base, because in the end, we do this because we love it. And it's a passion project for me. And I can promise you it's not going to be paying for my kids' college anytime soon, but that's not the reason for it. Like I've always had a love of literature. I'm not an author yet, maybe never will be. Don't have a literary degree. But I have a passion for writing. I have a passion for performance and sharing stories, and reminding us that, we are all very, very similar in many, many ways. And I say it a lot, but we are in this together. So thank you for spending a little time together with us tonight. Cheers. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks again. Cheers.